They say grief changes a man. I'd say it hollows him out, first strips away everything he thought he knew about himself, and then, slowly, painfully, fills him back up with something harder. Something that doesn't break as easy. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer in Denver, Colorado, and for 28 of those years, I came home every single evening to the same woman. The same laugh. The same smell of lavender and coffee that seemed to live permanently in the walls of our house on Maple Ridge Drive. Her name was Eleanor. I buried her on a Tuesday in March. The ground was still half frozen, and the sky was that particular shade of gray that Colorado does in early spring, not quite winter, not quite anything else. Just gray. Just cold. Just empty. The flowers people brought were yellow. She would have hated that. Eleanor always said yellow flowers at a funeral were someone else's idea of hope imposed on your grief. She would have wanted white roses, maybe some wildflowers from the field behind our property. But nobody asked me, and I didn't have the energy to correct anyone. I just stood there in my good black coat and watched them lower the only person who had ever truly known me into the earth. That was 14 months ago. I tell you this not because I want your sympathy, I've had enough of that to last several lifetimes, but because you need to understand what kind of man I was when my brother-in-law called me on that Thursday evening in May. You need to understand that I was still, in many ways, hollowed out. Still moving through rooms in that house on Maple Ridge Drive and forgetting, for half a second, why they felt so large. Still reaching for her hand in the morning before I was fully awake. A man in that condition is supposed to be vulnerable. Easy. David Mercer counted on that. Eleanor was the youngest of 3 siblings. Her older sister, Patricia, had moved to Phoenix years ago, and we'd always gotten along fine. Christmas cards, occasional phone calls, a visit every few years. Perfectly cordial. Perfectly unremarkable. David was the middle child. 58 years old, lived 40 minutes away in Aurora, sold commercial real estate, drove a truck that was slightly too expensive for what I knew he actually earned. He had Eleanor's same dark eyes, but none of her warmth. He was the kind of man who remembered every favor he'd ever done for anyone and forgot every one that had been done for him. Eleanor and David had never been particularly close. There was a distance between them that went back years, back to things that happened in their family long before I ever came into the picture. She rarely talked about it directly, but I knew. You spend 28 years with someone, you learn the shape of their old wounds even when they never show them to you directly. He called me on a Thursday. "Robert," he said. His voice had that particular quality it always had, like he was doing you a favor just by speaking to you. "I think we need to talk. About the house. About Eleanor's estate." I told him I was listening. "I've been going through some things," he said. "Some old documents. Some things Mom left behind before she passed. And Robert, I think there's a real question about whether Eleanor was in the right state of mind when she had her will drawn up." I remember exactly where I was standing when he said that. In the kitchen, by the window that looks out over the backyard, watching the aspen trees move in the late afternoon wind. Eleanor had planted those aspens herself, 12 years ago, in a row along the back fence. She'd read somewhere that aspens share a root system underground, that what looks like a grove of separate trees is actually one single organism connected beneath the surface. I remember thinking about that as David kept talking. He wanted a meeting. Him, me, Patricia, and an attorney he had already retained. He said it was just to explore the situation. He said he wasn't trying to make trouble. He just thought the family deserved answers. He said Eleanor's estate, the house, the investments, the property in the mountains she'd inherited from her father, all of it deserved a fresh look. What he meant was he wanted half. What he meant was he'd looked at what Eleanor had left behind and decided that my grief was an opportunity. I said I'd be there. I want to tell you about Eleanor's father, because you need that piece to understand everything that comes later. Harold Mercer built his money the old-fashioned way, slowly, carefully, over 50 years of work in commercial construction in Colorado. By the time he died, 7 years before Eleanor, he had a house in Denver, a mountain property outside Estes Park, worth just over $2 million, and a portfolio of investments that had been carefully tended for decades. He was a quiet man, deliberate, the kind of person who thought 3 times before he spoke once. Harold had 3 children. He loved all 3 of them. But Harold was also honest with himself about who they were. He'd watched David make financial decisions for 30 years. He'd seen the truck, the failed side businesses, the way money moved through David's hands like water through a sieve. He'd watched Patricia build a comfortable, stable life in Phoenix, not wealthy, but steady. And he'd watched Eleanor, his youngest, build something real. A career as an architect. A marriage that held. A life that had roots. Harold had a long conversation with Eleanor about 18 months before he died. I know this because she told me about it, sitting at our kitchen table on a Sunday morning, both of us in our robes, coffee going cold between us. "Daddy wants to leave the mountain property to me," she told me. "Just to me. He said he's leaving David and Patricia each a portion of the investments, but the house in Estes Park, he wants that to come to me." I asked her how she felt about that. She was quiet for a moment. "I think he's right," she said finally. "I think he knows exactly what he's doing." Harold died on a Wednesday in October, peaceful, in his own bed, the way he would have wanted. His will was clear. The mountain property went to Eleanor outright. The investment accounts were divided between David and Patricia. It was clean, it was legal, and it was exactly what Harold intended. David did not take it well. He hired an attorney at the time, made noise about contesting the will, talked about Harold's mental state in those final years. It went nowhere. Harold's documents were ironclad, his physician testified to his full competency, and the whole thing collapsed within 3 months. David had never forgotten it. And now Eleanor was gone, and the mountain property was mine, and David had apparently decided that the second time was going to go differently. The meeting was held on a Friday morning at a conference room in an office building in downtown Denver. David's attorney, a man named Curtis Fleming, youngish, well-dressed, with the specific kind of confidence that comes from being paid well to say things other people are afraid to say, had organized everything. There was a table, there were chairs, there were bottles of water lined up like we were about to negotiate a business deal. Patricia drove up from Phoenix. She looked uncomfortable from the moment she walked in, and she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. I'd always liked Patricia. I felt sorry for her that morning. David was already there when I arrived. He stood up when I came in, shook my hand, made a performance of being somber and reasonable. "Robert," he said, "thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy. Nothing about the next hour was going to be easy. But not for the reasons David thought." I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. I waited. Curtis Fleming cleared his throat and began. He had a folder in front of him, and he opened it with the careful deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed this moment. He explained that his client had reason to believe Eleanor's mental and emotional state in the period leading up to her death, and more specifically in the period during which her final will was executed, may have been compromised by the stress of her illness and the medications she was taking. He used phrases like undue influence and testamentary capacity. He talked about the mountain property and Eleanor's investment accounts, the total value of which he had somehow already calculated to the dollar. He talked about the family's rightful interest in Harold Mercer's legacy. He put several documents on the table, some I recognized, some I didn't, and slid them toward me. I looked at them. I nodded slowly. I did not speak. David watched me from across the table. I could see him trying to read me, trying to gauge how the hollow-eyed, grieving widower was receiving all of this. He had built this entire strategy on a version of me that no longer existed, or perhaps had never existed at all. "Robert," David said finally, leaning forward, his voice dropping into something that was trying very hard to sound like compassion. "Nobody wants this to go to court. Nobody wants this to become a thing. We're family. We just want what's fair." I looked at him for a long moment. "I know," I said. And then I reached into the briefcase I'd brought with me, the old brown leather one that had sat in my office closet for years, and I set my own folder on the table. "I need to tell you about the last real conversation I had with Eleanor. It was about 6 weeks before she died. She'd been in and out of the hospital, but she was home that week, doing better than she had in a while. And we had one of those strange grace period days that happen sometimes when someone is very ill, a day where the illness seemed to step back slightly and let you breathe, let you remember who you both were before all of this started. We were sitting on the back porch in the late afternoon. The aspens were turning. Eleanor had a blanket across her lap even though it wasn't that cold yet. I had coffee. She had tea because the coffee had been bothering her stomach for months. She said, "Robert, I need to tell you about some things I've been doing." I told her she didn't have to. "No," she said. "I want to. I need you to know so that when the time comes, you're not surprised. And I need you to know because I need you to understand that I knew exactly what I was doing. Every single bit of it." She told me about the conversations she'd had with her attorney, Martin Graves, a man she'd been working with for 3 years, long before her diagnosis. She told me about the documents she'd had drafted and redrafted. She told me about the letter she'd written, addressed to no one in particular, to be opened if anyone ever challenged the disposition of her estate. And then she told me about the video. Eleanor Mercer Callahan, my wife, my architect, my aspen planter, the woman who hated yellow flowers at funerals, had sat down in Martin Graves's office on a Tuesday afternoon, 8 months before her death, on a day when she was feeling strong and clear and fully herself, and she had recorded a 47-minute video statement. In it, she addressed her estate. She addressed her wishes. She addressed, by name, every specific concern she anticipated might be raised. She spoke about Harold's intention in leaving the mountain property to her. She spoke about her own intention in leaving it to me. She spoke about her medical condition, her medications, and the full, unimpaired clarity of her mind. And she spoke, by name, about her brother, David. She said she loved him. She said she forgave him for the things that had passed between them over the years. And then, in that precise, measured way she had the way she'd always had, since the first day I met her, she explained exactly why she had made every decision she had made, and exactly why those decisions were not his to question. She signed a notarized statement that day attesting to her competency. Her attorney witnessed it. Her physician signed a supporting affidavit. Martin Graves had filed everything with the court in advance. Eleanor had been a structural engineer's wife for 28 years. She understood better than most people that the integrity of a structure depends entirely on what you do before the weight comes down. She built her will to hold. I slid the folder across the conference table toward Curtis Fleming. He opened it. I watched his face as he read. "I have spent 31 years reading structural assessments, reading the places where a plan holds and the places where it fails. I know what a man's face looks like when he realizes the foundation has just given out beneath him." He read for about 90 seconds. Then he closed the folder very carefully and set it down. David said, "What is that?" "That," I said, "is a letter from Martin Graves, your sister's attorney, who has been in possession of Eleanor's video statement, her signed competency declaration, and her physician's supporting affidavit for the past 14 months. He's also filed a preemptive motion with the court that addresses, specifically, any claim of compromised testamentary capacity. It was prepared at Eleanor's request, while she was alive, because she knew this conversation was coming. The room was very quiet. Patricia had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at the table. David looked at me. Then he looked at his attorney. Curtis Fleming was studying the folder again, very carefully, and he had the look of a man who is privately recalculating several things at once. "She couldn't have known," David started. "She knew," I said. "She knew you, David. She'd known you her whole life." He opened his mouth again. Then he closed it. There's a particular kind of silence that falls in a room when something is finished, not just paused, not just interrupted, but actually finished. The air changes. The weight of it settles. I've felt it at the end of long projects, at the moment you sign the final documentation and know the structure is complete. I felt it in that conference room on that Friday morning. Curtis Fleming spoke next, in the careful tone of an attorney who is now focused entirely on limiting his client's exposure. He said something about reviewing the new documentation. He said something about his client needing time to consider. It was the sound of an argument being quietly, professionally disassembled. David didn't say much after that. He sat very still and looked at his hands. I don't know what he was thinking. Part of me didn't want to know. I shook Patricia's hand when I left. She held it a moment longer than necessary. "She loved you," Patricia said quietly. "You know that." I know. I said. I drove home on 70 West with the windows down, even though it was cold. I needed the air. I needed to feel something moving. I went past the exits I'd taken 1,000 times in 30 years of commuting, past the familiar landmarks, the places that held ordinary memories that had become precious simply because they were shared. I didn't go home right away. I drove up to Estes Park instead. It's about 90 minutes from Denver if you take the right roads. I hadn't been to the mountain property since Eleanor died. I'd been afraid to go, if I'm honest. Afraid of what it would feel like to be in that place without her. It felt like her. That's the only way I can describe it. The house sits on 12 acres above the tree line, with a view of the mountains that makes you feel very small in a way that is somehow comforting rather than frightening. Eleanor had loved it since she was a child. Her father had taken her there every summer. She'd taught herself to identify every tree, every bird, every kind of cloud formation from that porch. I sat on that porch for a long time. Martin Graves called me later that afternoon. He told me that Curtis Fleming had called his office and informed him that his client would not be pursuing the matter further. He said it in his lawyer's voice, flat and professional, but at the end, he paused for a moment and said, "Eleanor was remarkable. Robert, the preparation she put into this, she thought of everything. I told him I knew. I told him she always had." Before I left the mountain property, I went inside and walked through the rooms. Eleanor's father's furniture was still there, the old leather chairs, the bookshelves, the writing desk by the window where Harold used to sit in the mornings. Eleanor had added things over the years, her drafting tools, a few of her own architectural sketches framed on the walls, a collection of rocks she'd gathered from the property over decades. On the kitchen counter, there was an envelope. I hadn't noticed it the last time I'd been there, but it had been so long, maybe it had always been there. My name was written on the front in Eleanor's handwriting. Just Robert. Nothing else. My hands weren't entirely steady when I opened it. It wasn't a long letter. Eleanor had never been someone who used 10 words when 3 would do. But I want to tell you what it said, because I think about it most days, and because I think it says something true that not enough people say out loud. She wrote that she wasn't leaving me the mountain property as a gift. She was leaving it to me as a place where I could go to remember that grief is not the same thing as loss. She wrote that losing someone is not the same as losing what you built together. She wrote that the aspens at the house on Maple Ridge Drive share one root system underground. She had told me this herself, years ago, and that she thought the same was probably true of people who had really loved each other for long enough. She wrote that she'd taken care of everything she could take care of, because that was the only way she knew how to keep loving me after she was gone. She signed it the way she always signed things to me, in the private shorthand we'd developed somewhere in the middle of 28 years, just the letter E. And beneath it, a small drawing of an aspen leaf. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. I'm not a man who cries easily. I was raised in a generation and in a part of this country where men were not encouraged to let those things show. But I stood in that kitchen in Estes Park with my wife's last letter in my hands, looking out at those mountains, and I let myself cry. Not the careful, controlled kind. The real kind. The kind that comes from so far down you don't entirely recognize it as yourself when it comes out. When it passed, I felt, and I know this sounds strange, I felt steadier, like something had been put back in the right place. I drove home in the early evening, watching the sky change colors over the Rockies the way it does out here, pink first, then a deep orange, then a purple that seems almost artificial, almost too beautiful to be real. Eleanor used to say Colorado sunsets were the state's way of apologizing for the winters. I've thought a lot, in the months since that Friday morning in the conference room, about what David was actually hoping to get. Not the money, specifically, or not only the money. I think there was something else underneath it. Some old hunger that had nothing to do with real estate or inheritance or the mountain property outside Estes Park. Some need to revise a story that had never gone the way he wanted it to. I don't carry anger toward him. I want to be honest about that, not because I'm a better man than I perhaps have a right to be, but because Eleanor didn't, and I have spent enough years learning from her that her instincts feel, at this point, like something close to my own. She forgave him in that video. She said it clearly, looking directly into the camera, in the measured and generous way she had. She said she forgave him, and she explained exactly why she was not letting forgiveness change her decisions. That is, I think, one of the most intelligent and honest things I have ever heard any person say about forgiveness. That it's not the same as permission. That it's not the same as agreement. That you can release someone from your anger and still refuse to let them rewrite your story. Eleanor knew that. She understood it in her bones. Patricia called me about 6 weeks after the meeting. We talked for almost an hour longer than we'd talked in years. She told me she hadn't known, not really, what David had in mind until she was already sitting in that conference room. She said she felt sick about it. She said Eleanor deserved better from her family. I told her Eleanor had gotten exactly what she deserved. That she'd built her life the way she built everything else, carefully, honestly, with an eye toward what would hold. Patricia laughed at that. It was a watery kind of laugh, the kind that's sitting right next to tears. That sounds like her, she said. It does. The mountain property is mine. The house on Maple Ridge Drive is mine. The aspens Eleanor planted 12 years ago along the back fence are coming back now that spring is finally here, leafing out in that particular pale green that aspens have in early May, shivering even in the lightest wind. I've been going up to Estes Park more. I take Eleanor's letter with me sometimes, in the front pocket of my jacket, even though I have it memorized by now. I sit on that porch and I look at those mountains, and I think about root systems. About what connects underground, out of sight, between things that look separate from the outside. I think about the structure Eleanor built before she left. I think about the 47-minute video, the notarized documents, the attorney who'd been quietly holding everything in place for 14 months. I think about the kind of love that looks ahead. The kind that doesn't just grieve what's coming but prepares for it, that refuses to leave the people it loves unprotected. I was a structural engineer for 31 years. I know better than most people that the strength of anything, a building, a bridge, a life, lives in the parts you can't see. In the foundations laid before the weight arrives. In the connections buried deep, where weather can't reach them. Eleanor understood that better than I did. She always had. The people who love us most don't just love us in the present, they love us forward. Eleanor didn't spend her final months in fear. She spent them building something that would hold long after she was gone. That kind of love isn't passive. It plans, it protects, it refuses to leave the ones it cherishes exposed. If someone has ever loved you that quietly and that thoroughly, you already know what it feels like to be held by a foundation you can't see. A small note worth sharing. This story was crafted and imagined by AI, created to bring you a moment of meaningful entertainment and to leave you with something warm to carry into your day.